Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We're excited you're all here. Today's session is going to focus on some strategies that transportation agencies can use to improve safety for all road users at intersections, specifically our vulnerable road users, pedestrians and bicyclists. Balancing user needs, safety, and comfort at intersections is a familiar challenge for many of you all working in transportation, and we hope to share some ideas and inspiration that you can use to tackle these problems in your communities. This webinar is supported by the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety through a program led by VHB and the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, providing training and technical assistance to FHWA designated pedestrian and bicyclist focus cities and states. And we're excited that this webinar is actually jointly presented with the FHWA's Intersection Safety Focus program as well. So shortly, we're going to have Jeff Shaw from FHWA talk a little bit about how FHWA supports road safety efforts throughout the United States through the Focused Approach to Safety initiative. So we're grateful for the combining of the two programs together to bring us this webinar. My name is Dan Jaleen, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. I'd like to take a few minutes, and just introduce you to each of the panelists who will be joining us today. I mentioned already that we'll be hearing from Jeff Shaw. Jeff is the Intersections Program Manager for the FHWA Office of Safety, so we're excited to hear from him. Joining us from the city of Pittsburgh is Karina Ricks, who serves as the inaugural director of the city's new Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. As director of the department, Karina oversees transportation investments and policies that support the physical mobility needed for the people of Pittsburgh to pursue the economic mobility they aspire to. We're also joined by Carl Sundstrom, who is the Senior Project Analyst for the New York City Department of Transportation's Street Improvement Program, which includes the units that develop and implement bicycle, pedestrian, and public space projects. In his role, Carl develops and evaluates new design treatments, manages improvement programs, data collection and analysis, and conducts project evaluations. We'll also be hearing from Bastian Schroeder, a principal engineer at Kittleson and Associates. Bastian has over 14 years of experience in applied research and has a passion for developing solutions to complex problems across all areas of transportation. He specializes in multimodal safety and operations of traffic systems at the intersection, corridor, network, and policy levels for local, state, and federal agencies. We are grateful to all of our panelists for joining us today and agreeing to present. We're grateful for your presence here during the webinar, and I want to tell you a little bit about your experience as an attendee today, cover a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the material that we have ready for you. Attendees, I want to let you know that though you won't be able to speak during the webinar, you do have the ability to communicate with us and with me by using the questions pod. You can send in questions and comments as we move along. I'll do my best to respond to those as we get them. And I'll also be flagging and tagging some really good discussion questions that you send to me for the discussion period that we have planned for the end of the webinar, about 25 minutes or so, where we'll be responding directly to your questions. If you have any issues with the webinar today, I suggest that you close it out, reload it. That can usually solve a lot of the problems you might find. Also, switching between audio formats in terms of the computer audio or a phone call might help solve some of the audio issues that may be coming up today. We will be posting pretty soon here a link to our archive page, which is going to have a copy of the webinar presentation slides that we're sharing. So if you miss anything today, you will be able to look back at it. We're going to be posting those and sharing them with you. We're also going to be recording the webinar, and we plan to embed that video link on our archive page as well. So you'll be able to watch the webinar again if you like. Later today, you're going to be receiving an email from me that'll have links to those archive pages that I just mentioned. It's also going to have a link that will allow you to generate a certificate of attendance for this webinar today. So if you need that to report any professional development hours or PDHs, things like that, you can use that certificate. We've also submitted and had this webinar approved by the American Planning Association for 1.5 CM credits. So you can check the online AICP event calendar for more information about claiming those credits. Keep an eye on our website for news and information about our upcoming webinars. You can sign up for our newsletter, check us out on social media. These are all ways that you can find out about different webinars we have coming up on topics that you may also be interested in. Before we get into Jeff's piece on the focused approach to safety, what I'd like to do is ask a poll question. We actually have several of these poll questions coming up today. hope you all can share some of your expertise with us. This first poll question is really trying to get a sense of how many people are attending the webinar today. So we know that some of you are joined by other colleagues at your desk. We'd just like you to respond to this question to see if we can get a better read on how many people are out there today. I'm only going to leave this up for a little while. I've got another poll, and then I'm going to go right over to Jeff Shaw to talk about the focused approach to safety. So I appreciate your responses to this poll. We'll leave it open for just a few more seconds. All right. Thank you all so much for that. I'm going to close it. And with this next poll question, I'd like to ask you all to tell us a little bit about yourselves, specifically the type of organization that you represent. We've got a few options on the screen here. I know we're not reflecting every organization type that you all represent. We can only have a few options for this question. So if you're with another type of organization, please click other. We are asking about state DOTs or local or regional planning, engineering, or transportation agencies, private consultants, health departments. We know you all represent a variety of organizations. So just tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'll read out the results to let the panelists know kind of who's in the room today. All right, just a few more seconds on this poll, and then I'll close it down, and we can take a look at the results. All right, I'm going to close it and share these results because I think it's pretty interesting. We've got a pretty even share of you, 28% from state DOTs, 32% from local or regional planning, transportation, engineering agencies, about 26% from private consultants. So those are all pretty even, those first three. Not many of you are representing health departments, but some of you are. And then lots of you are with other organization types. I'd like to ask you to send me a note in the questions pod telling me what kind of organizations you're representing, because that's a pretty big chunk. Maybe it tells me I need to choose different options for my next poll question when I do this one again. I appreciate that, and hopefully that's informative to our panelists to let them know kind of who you all are representing today. Let me hide those results, put the slide up now that talks a little bit about the focused approach to safety, because Jeff Shaw, again from FHWA's Office of Safety, is here to tell us a little bit more about this program. It'll be a helpful lead into the rest of our panelists. So Jeff, please go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, Dan, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. As Dan mentioned during the lead-in, this webinar is being put together as a joint effort under our Focused Approach program umbrella between the Intersection program and the Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety program. And so just to say a little bit about that, so if we look at the percentage of fatalities represented by intersections and pedestrians and bicycles totally, it represents just over a third of all traffic fatalities in the U.S. And about 6% of those are pedestrian and bicycle fatalities occurring at intersections. Now that's a small percentage, but as a total of what's happening across the country, that's over 2,000 people. That's roughly 2,400 people killed each year walking and biking through intersections. And so that's a lot of people that we have an opportunity to save by creating safer and more convenient places for people to walk and bike. So we're working to do more collaborative projects between our two programs within the Office of Safety. The focused approach is an opportunity to provide additional training and technical assistance to focus states and cities across the U.S. that have a more pronounced challenge in these areas than do the average state. And so right now we've got about 36 cities across 7 states, and we've got 9 intersection focus states in addition to that. 7 of those states cross over both programs, so we've got some really good opportunities to be working in a focused fashion with these cities located in 7 states. And you can learn more about that by following the links that Dan's provided on this slide. But just to say that this is something that we're very much working to do more on. You know, for too long it's been, let's look at ways to enhance safety for pedestrians and bicycles without understanding the comprehensive impacts that are happening across an intersection. Or let's look at intersection safety measures that maybe are beneficial for motor vehicle crash reduction without really fully understanding the impacts to the pedestrian and bicyclists. So we're gaining better understanding, more nuanced understanding of safety, and I think as we embark upon a new generation that is looking at a safe systems approach to intersection planning and design, we're going to have more opportunities to look at how to provide safer intersections for walking and biking, as well as for vehicles moving through them as well. So with that said, I would like to thank Karina, Carl, and Bastian for their presentations today. I've had the chance to see some of their material in advance, and I'm familiar with the work that they're doing. I think this is fabulous stuff. Certainly from the city perspective, you know, that's where a lot of the innovation is occurring, is at that local level. And I think there's a lot to be learned that can transfer to the states as well. And then the work that Bastian's been doing on the research side, really kind of characterizing all of the ingredients of safety at intersections for people walking and biking is going to be very helpful going forward. So thanks to the three of them for that today. And Dan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I appreciate it. I hope everyone will have a chance to visit some of these websites and learn more about these and some of the other focus areas that FHWA is working on. Before we move on, I don't want to fail to mention some of the other organization types you all represent, because you sent in a lot of good info, and I'm encouraged to see that we've got a lot of representation from universities, students, as well as researchers, other federal agencies like FHWA and NHTSA, tribal governments and tribal organizations, as well as community members and individual safety advocates and neighbors and those living in our community. So we've got a really good variety of perspectives on this webinar today, and I hope you'll continue to provide your feedback to us using the questions pod and through our poll questions and participate in the discussion a little bit later. I want to go ahead and move into our first presentation from Karina Ricks in Pittsburgh. So Karina, I'm going to send the screen to you. I'll let you know when I can see what you've got, and we'll move right in from there. I see your the screen with the email on it. So, and then now if you can go to display settings at the top and just swap, yeah, like we did the other day. Perfect. All right, you're on, Karina.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, Jeff, for allowing us to be a part of this presentation. What I'm going to talk just briefly about, I'll speak at a much higher level, I think, than the other presenters on this, but talking about the importance of intuitive design and what that means, how you sort of see things through that lens, and how we make planning and design decisions based on that ethos. So maybe just a little bit before we get there, talking about the general philosophy and mission of the department that I'm fortunate enough to lead. The Department of Mobility and Infrastructure is a relatively new department in the city of Pittsburgh. It was, as many departments of transportation, it was born, extracted out of a combination of the Department of Public Works and the Department of City Planning to bring this together. But it is very inspiring to me that our name is the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, because mobility has these two definitions associated with it. It, of course, has the definition of the ability to move freely and easily from place to place. But mobility also talks about social mobility and economic mobility. And we know from research at Harvard University that the two are inextricably linked. That the travel time to destinations, and importantly, the travel time to employment opportunities, is the single most important factor in determining a household's ability to leave poverty and better themselves and future generations. So the really thinking about mobility and transportation as an economic development, a social development, community development tool, and that ability to provide free and easy movement and reliable travel times is the number one factor in bringing people to allow them to pursue their economic mobility pursuits. So that is what drives our department and how we organize ourselves. And then we organize ourselves really around 5 key goals that we try and look through the lens of these when we take on projects. and designs and to make investment decisions. So the first is fairly blunt. No one dies or is seriously injured traveling on city streets. That is the Vision Zero or the Toward Zero goal that we have, but we take that down sort of a little bit of a more nuance to it of how are we going to get to that goal, that end state that we believe is achievable, that no one dies or is seriously injured, is if we are really designing streets and intersections that are intuitive to use and that we're using as our test subject, our design vehicle, if you will, an adolescent child. So we'll talk some more about that through the rest of the presentation. The second goal is that every resident can access fresh fruits and vegetables within 20 minutes travel of home, and it does not require the ownership, operation, and maintenance cost of a private automobile in order to do that. So that's 20 minutes door to door, not 20 minutes from the time you board the bus or 20 minutes from the time that you've gotten your Uber arriving there, but that every resident can access and that it can be at a price point that really provides that access, fresh fruits and vegetables within 20 minutes of home. And then, we can map this, we can measure this, we can see where our deficiencies are. We can work with our city planning department to solve it on a land use side, and we can solve it on the transportation side. Our third goal is that all trips less than 1 mile are most enjoyably achieved by non-vehicle travel. And so that too gives an indication of how we should be thinking about our intersections and our street designs. Is it enjoyable? Is it something that we feel good about doing, where I feel a little bit sad? I usually bike to work, and yesterday I got a flat tire and I felt a little bit sad that I couldn't bike into the office because it is the most pleasant way for me to make that 4 mile trip. Can we make it so that others feel that same way, whether they're old or young or able-bodied or have certain physical limitations? Can it be an enjoyable experience to be out there in the world rather than circling in a private automobile? And of course, that has great benefits accruing to congestion management. If we can take those short distance trips out of the vehicle mode, we can free up, 20, 30% of the capacity on our roads just by getting those short distance vehicle trips out of vehicles. We can improve social cohesion, we can improve sense of place, we can add to economic development. So there's a lot of additional benefits by pursuing that goal. The fourth goal is that transportation, housing, and energy, which is important in this part of the country, consume less than 40% of household income for any income quintile. Housing costs in Pittsburgh, as in other places of the country, are rising, and that means that we may not be able to keep those housing prices down, but it's incumbent on my department to find ways to drive transportation costs lower then, so that the net total is something that's affordable to our families, so they still have enough resources to pursue other objectives in life. And then the fifth is just that streets and infrastructure reflect the pride and values of our city. So this is the city that gave you Mr. Rogers, and we very much associate with that. That is a core value of our city, and we need to look at our streets and intersections and say, does this convey the amount of human love? Does this convey the other community and social values that we have in our city? Because if it does not, we're doing something wrong and we're telling the wrong story about our city. So I want to just dwell a little bit on that notion of streets and intersections are intuitive to use even by an adolescent child. So this is important. We do take this adolescent child, so think of the 12 or 13 or 14-year-old that you love most in your life, and put them on that intersection that you've just designed. Do you trust them without any further instruction, without any further guidance? Do you have faith and confidence in that design that that child will be able to navigate to the other side of the intersection safely, reliably, that the other travelers at that intersection will be able to see and respond to and protect that child, because all of us have an obligation to do that? If that answer is yes, if we feel very, very certain that individual that is in our mind's eye that we're designing for can navigate that intersection, that's great, because that means if that child can navigate the intersection safely, it probably means that a person with disabilities will be able to manage that intersection as well. It will be obvious to them and obvious to the other users of the intersection what their intended path of travel is, how they can best respond to it. For busy professionals who are maybe looking at cell phones or juggling groceries or pushing children in strollers or whatever it might be, that if we can use that test case of the adolescent child as our design vehicle, we really are then able to design for a whole host of other users. So really it is a qualitative measure, but it's one that you can really sit out there and discuss and look at it and say what is going to happen. And it's not just for walking, it's also for bicycling. So do we believe that a child will know where that bike facility, how they're supposed to cross that intersection, where they should position themselves to make their next move, if they're perhaps making a turn at the intersection. Again, do the other users of the intersection, do they have the opportunity to respond to and protect that child that's traveling through there? This needs to be the objective that we're working toward. And in Pittsburgh, it can be a bit of a challenge that we have in front of us because many of our intersections are anything but intuitive out on their own. So we have, as you can see, the quote from Ernie Pyle, it's often said that the streets of Pittsburgh have been laid out by a mountain goat. We're a hilly city, we're a complex city. We lack the standard grid that many of you enjoy. And so finding ways to make intersections, and those are real intersections that are on the right side of, and those are only a sampling of the intersections that we have to deal with, how we are going through a design that is intuitive for anyone, let alone a vulnerable user, is a real challenge for us. And so we really take this very seriously to consider what is happening there. And then we think about the features that we're putting out into our streets. So the pedestrian actuated signals are good. They bring great efficiency to the throughput of our intersections. But when you really start to look at these things through the eyes of a child, you have to ask yourself, do they have the language literacy enough to really understand what that's saying? Do they have adequate English proficiency that they can really understand what that's saying? It doesn't help us that we use this same sign, but for leaving off that fourth panel at the bottom, we use the same sign for our audible signals. And so that is a nuance that is lost on most of the general public and certainly lost on children, and that makes these intersections wildly less intuitive. If sometimes you need to push the button and something happens, and sometimes you don't, and sometimes there's a ped head, a pedestrian light on the other side, and sometimes you're supposed to follow the green ball when you're going. So intuitive design really means you have to think about it. If you are fresh arrival to this area, how are you supposed to understand this if you haven't had the benefit, of your driver training and 40 years of traveling on public streets? You don't have that life experience that you're bringing to it. How are these designs supposed to be intuitive? And then we have intersections like this, the real intersection in Pittsburgh. Maybe some of you are noting that it is a 5-legged intersection, which you can only cross 4 of those legs. There is not the 5th crossing. There's good reason why that 5th crossing doesn't exist. But is that intuitive? Is a child, and I will note that there is a high school and an elementary school on either side of this intersection down a ways, and this is a bus corridor that they use to get there. Is a child expected to know that when those white lines are not painted, they may not cross, but that is not a safe place for them to do it? Can we do better than that? Is it intuitive, the direction of travel that they're supposed to take? This is an intersection that we're working on, and we do have some improvements coming here, but this is something where we really do need to stand there together as a team, understanding all of the rules and protocols and design guidelines that exist, and recognizing just the human element of being out there on the street. So again, this is really something, it's qualitative, but it's a lens that we use as we think about this. And we're learning every day what it means and what are the limits that we can really exercise if we are to achieve this goal. And again, this is a sub-goal under the overall imperative that we have, which is that no one dies or is seriously injured on our streets. Font issues there, but we are pursuing at this time a pedestrian safety action plan. And so we are needing to think about what does this mean? How do we actually bake this into policy and action agendas? So we need to understand that there are different cultural norms even within our own city, and what might be intuitive, comfortable, or safe in one neighborhood or for one age group may not be the right answer for another. And so thinking about the diversity of our communities, we need to think about how we, what are the practices that we can, in addition to the design changes that we can make in our intersections, the practices that we can teach those in our community. And then really starting to understand preferences and putting those into the plan so that we can pursue additional actions there. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to come visit Pittsburgh. Lovely time of year. And I guess I will turn that back over to Ben.
Right. Thank you very much, Karina. That was awesome. A great introduction to some of the other issues that our other panelists will get into as well. So I'm excited to see all the things you're working on in Pittsburgh and encouraged by all the progress you're making. I'm going to move the screen to our next panelist, Carl Sundstrom in New York City. Carl, once you have the screen, I'm actually going to launch a poll question first, and then we'll get into to the presentation. So I'll let you know when I can see what you've got. We're going to ask everyone a poll question right after that. Carl, I've got your screen, so I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll question first. And what we want to ask you all about is on this topic of when you're trying to make some of the changes and improvements to intersection safety that Karina was talking about. What do you find in your work and in your experiences are the biggest challenges to doing that, to making those improvements to intersection safety? We want you to try to just pick one here. We've got a few different options. Is it because do you think you've got just a lack of familiarity with the countermeasures or design strategies available? Is that a challenge for improving intersection safety? Is it limited funding for making the necessary improvements, or maybe a lack of staff capacity to really figure out the safety problems and make those changes? Maybe you don't have an adopted plan that really can keep you from knowing how to best address this problem, or maybe it's something else. And we've already got a few other comments coming into the chat pod. So I'm going to leave this open for a minute. This is just to get you thinking. We're kind of curious from your perspective about what those challenges are as you try to work on intersection safety in your communities. I'm just going to leave this open maybe a few more seconds, and then I'll show you the results. Actually, while you're continuing to vote, I'll mention some of the things coming in the chat pod here. A lot of mentions of lacking political will to make some of the changes. I think that's certainly the case in a lot of places. Let's see, public feedback. Maybe people are generally sometimes can be opposed to some of the changes you want to make. I think that's certainly common. So those are some of the things coming in here, and then just understanding the balance in offsetting with capacity. That balance between safety and mobility is often cited. So let me close this poll because I'm interested to show you all these results. So I think it looks like the winner here, 53% of you mentioned the limited funding for making these improvements, and certainly I think that's often cited. I think if you're forced to pick one of these, that's a pretty common choice. Second place was the 15% of you have no adopted plan to really formalize that prioritization and process, and then 12% lack of familiarity with countermeasures, 11% lack of staff capacity. Many of you in the chat pod and in the other category said all of the above, and so I didn't include that option, but that certainly is the case, and a lot of other ideas are coming in as well. So hopefully this can segue into our discussion later, but I thought that'd be interesting to ask you all that question and for our panelists to see. So when I hide it now, we're going to go into our presentation from New York City. Carl, I kind of snuck that up on you. I don't know if you can weave any of that feedback into your presentation. I'm sure New York City faces a lot of similar challenges in many respects, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Carl Sundstrom from New York City DOT.
All right, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. Is the audio okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Great. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for attending. So, I guess as Karina mentioned, she really focused on sort of a thoughtful approach and discussed sort of the overarching policies and approaches that the cities and agencies should focus on. And so I'll just briefly touch on some of our policies and how they affect our safety planning and implementation. But then I'm going to dive into a lot of our tools for intersection redesigns in New York. In particular, going to focus on some of our new programs and treatments, many of which are still evolving, but that we've seen a lot of success with, and they seem to be quite effective. Many of them are done with low-cost materials and signal timing improvements. So there's not a great cost to it, and a lot of the stuff can be implemented pretty quickly. And I feel like it could be done in a lot of cities around the country. And so just to touch on our Vision Zero program, which guides a lot of our transportation planning and safety efforts in New York. It's a multi-agency policy that focuses on preventing crashes through comprehensive legislation, planning, enforcement, engineering, and education efforts. And the idea is to really change public policy and mindsets through this Vision Zero program. And it has brought us success in terms of reducing traffic fatalities, particularly pedestrian fatalities. We've seen a lot of success. And they've been steadily falling, as you can see on the screen here, even though we've seen a pretty large growth in population and jobs and tourists since 2014. But of course, Vision Zero is about saving every single life. So we're going to continue to do what we know is working, but we're going to also keep expanding into new programs and policies and try to keep working at getting that number all the way down to zero. And this map here shows the Vision Zero priority geographies that guide many of our Vision Zero safety improvements. We have on the screen here, you can see the priority intersections, corridors, and areas. And all of those have been identified. Each of the 5 boroughs was ranked independently based on pedestrian killed and severely injured, so KSI crashes. And those have all been ranked, and we picked the highest KSI locations for intersections, corridors, and areas. And that really helps us prioritize a lot of our improvements that we kind of roll out citywide. And then we also, it's not shown, we also have some Vision Zero bike priority areas, which were based both on cyclist KSI crashes, but also bringing in a layer that focuses on dedicated bike facilities and identifying the locations with high ridership and high crashes that also have a lack of bike facilities, and to really start focusing some of our efforts in those bike priority areas. And there's a link to this website here, vzv.nyc, the Vision Zero viewer. So you can go onto this website if you're curious to see more about our priority geographies. It also maps our crashes and maps a lot of where our treatments have been installed. And I have several other links up throughout this presentation, but if you download the slide deck that Dan put up there, the link that Dan put up there, you should be able to access a lot of the reports and stuff that I referenced. And so one of our first Vision Zero efforts was to reduce the citywide speed limit from 30 miles an hour to 25 miles an hour. And so that occurred in late 2014. And since then, we've been working really hard to retime all of our major streets down to a 25 mile an hour progression. And it takes time and it's a lot of work, but we think it really has a pretty big effect in terms of really reducing speeding and reducing especially those the highest of speeds. So we've made a lot of progress on a lot of those streets, and we'll continue to get to the rest. And then at the same time, we also have a pretty robust automated enforcement program where we have 150 red light running cameras that are active, and we're expanding our speed enforcement camera program to reach 750 school zones. So before I dig into the specific programs itself, I just want to give kind of an overview of the approach we take for many of our bicycle and pedestrian projects, especially at intersections. And so we start with kind of a traditional approach where we look at, the traffic analysis, and we do some field observations, kind of see what's happening out there, see what the capacity is on the street, and as well as like things that are happening on the street that could be fixed. Seeing what's happening like in the curbside lane, for example, if there's a lot of double parking or other issues that we might be able to address. We also take stock of like if there's the bike facilities and the bus lanes and bus routes that may be out there. And then we really try to roll up our sleeves and try to simplify the intersections, remove some movements, make some signal timing adjustments. Sometimes that includes banning certain turns, really focusing on accommodating those desire lines, especially for pedestrians. So that may mean adding some median islands or closing slip lanes, adding some diagonal crosswalks. It really is specific to each intersection. And then we also focus on making the road users more visible just by increasing the pedestrian space, shortening crossings, and really just making sure that we're designing safe facilities for everyone. We also, as best we can, try to bring in community partners and other folks that can turn a lot of these reclaimed spaces into more social spaces for people. And a lot of this is done with our low-cost toolkit of things like epoxy gravel, using a lot of delineators, and concrete, using granite blocks and jersey barriers, and then in addition to that, doing some signal work. So a lot of this is pretty low cost. It avoids a lot of the challenges that you run into around intersections, especially with running into drainage issues. So it's a nice way to kind of get something out there on the ground, and then you can look in the future at sort of doing the more capital build out. And so, one of our major tools for reducing conflicts between pedestrians and turning drivers are the leading pedestrian intervals that we're rapidly installing citywide. So far, we've installed over 3,700 LPIs. That includes over 700 just this year. And the way that the LPIs work are that they allow pedestrians to get at least a 7-second head start. So I believe it could be lower in some cities, but we start at 7 seconds and go up from there. And so that gives pedestrians a head start to move into the crosswalk before vehicles begin to move, and lets them establish the right of way. Oftentimes it gets them, totally across the travel lane where drivers may be turning. And it really it's effective at reducing pedestrian vehicle conflicts. And in terms of our installation criteria, you can see we've installed a lot. And so we have sort of two standard criteria. One is the expedited, where if you're in one of those Vision Zero priority areas, or if there's been a fatality, or if it's in a school zone, or if there's in a zone with a lot of senior pedestrians, or a location where a bus makes a turn, that will get an LPI right away. And then we also will do more of a standard analysis where if there have been 3 or more failure to yield crashes, or if there's a high number of turning vehicles, we'll also put an LPI in. And so anytime we retime our corridors, like we're retiming these corridors to be 25 miles an hour, we just look at the geography and go ahead and put LPIs in along the entire corridor. But one challenge that we've had is, when you're holding through traffic back for 7 seconds, that really does impact traffic capacity, which can, depending on how saturated your street conditions are, can have a really big impact and lead to gridlock, blocking the box further upstream from these intersections, that sort of thing. So we really had to think a lot about this, and how do we balance the multimodal needs and ensure that we have safe crossings for pedestrians by providing these LPIs, but also not taking too big of a hit on our traffic congestion. And so what we came up with was what we call we've been calling a split LPI, or we call a delayed turn, where essentially what we do is we add a turn lane. So in this example here, it's an intersection, which is pretty typical for us, of 2 one-way streets. And we add a turn lane for, in this case, the left turning vehicles. They are held with a green arrow during the LPI phase, where the through traffic gets to go and the pedestrians get to go. And then after 7 seconds or so, we'll put up a flashing yellow arrow and allow the drivers to turn once the intersection is clear of pedestrians and they can safely turn. So this is sort of a nice way to provide that LPI on some of these more congested corridors without really impacting that through volume. And I'll get to this later. I'm going to talk about the sort of bike intersection design later, but this is something that we've also been experimenting with a bike lane too, and seeing how that functions under the same design. And speaking of bikes, we're also just looking at how we can bring the benefits of this safe head start to bicycles as well. And so one of our council members proposed a change that allows bikes to use the LPI. And after some back and forth among our different agencies, we were asked to conduct a pilot test of allowing bikes to use the LPI first, and just to see if there were any concerns. So one of the bigger concerns was would this impact pedestrian safety in terms of cyclists maybe not yielding to pedestrians who are crossing during the LPI. So what we did is we did an observational study where we're just kind of looking at the behaviors of cyclists out there today at locations where there are LPIs. And that we did find that already today, almost virtually every cyclist is using the LPI. They're not waiting for the green ball to go. So this is kind of already existing, and we didn't observe at any of the intersections any conflicts at all between pedestrians and cyclists. And then we also did a crash comparison. So we were able to put these signs up that you see in the photo here that bikes may use the pedestrian signal, and we compare that to 50 similar intersections and during the 6-month pilot period, and we didn't see any impacts to crashes at all. In fact, there were no LPI related bicycle and pedestrian crashes. So we felt pretty good about this, and we recommended that this become the rule citywide. Unless it's otherwise signed. So there might be some unique cases where we wouldn't want a cyclist to go on the LPI, in which case we would sign it as such, but otherwise we wouldn't have these signs that say bikes may use ped signal. It'd just be the case that bikes may go on the LPI. And just last week, the legislation was signed by City Council, so this hopefully should be going into effect, I think, sometime in December. And should also mention that this is something that Washington, D.C. has had for many years, and they've had, I think, they felt like that was a positive change as well. And then I want to talk about this next program here, the left turn traffic calming. A few years ago, we started really looking at the safety of our intersections, especially around turning vehicle crashes, hitting pedestrians. And what we found is that pedestrian and bicyclists killed or severely injured, so the KSI crashes from left turns occur 3 times more often than right turn pedestrian and bicycle KSI crashes. And we also saw that older pedestrians, seniors, are particularly vulnerable to left turn crashes. And then we dug into the data a little bit more and saw that most of these were 80% of them were at signalized intersections, and 2/3 of them were at intersections with at least one-way street. So that kind of gave us a sense for what the problem, where the problem is occurring, and how we could sort of prioritize our improvements, and as well as a way to sort of design a solution to this problem. And part of what we think is occurring with the left turns is that there's a large conflict zone, as you can see in the diagram here, where basically the drivers are kind of cutting that corner and coming at a faster approach speed, and also leaving pedestrians more exposed for a longer crossing. So that, I think, is a big part of it. And then just the vehicle design itself, where the A pillar might be obscuring pedestrians, is another issue with the left turns. And if you want to read more about it, there's a link here on the slide that you can look into later to read more, read the full report. And so what we did is we designed a left turn traffic calming toolkit. You can see here, this shows an initial, just the hardened center line is what we call it, where we put some vertical delineators on the center line itself to sort of guide that driver around the corner and won't allow them to kind of cut the corner and cross that center line. And so you can see that cuts that pedestrian exposure distance in half right there. And so this is something that, we tried it out. It looks pretty good. We started rolling out and evolving the program. Here's a photo of an additional treatment. So we have that. There's a photo of the hardened center line. And then on the lower left there, you see a slow turn wedge. And this program could be done, you can use a combination of these treatments. They can be used individually. So for example, you might use we would use that slow turn wedge, but not a hardened center line if you were turning onto a one-way street where we couldn't use a hardened center line. And then the slow turn wedge itself, we've been experimenting with different materials, like using rubber speed bumps in there, or even raising it up with asphalt. And so we've been evaluating this treatment, and we found that the median left turn speeds have decreased by over 20%. The maximum speeds have decreased by almost 20%. Vehicles crossing the double yellow line has basically been eliminated, which makes sense. But there has been some durability issues where in the photo on the right, you can see a rubber speed bump, and then behind that are those delineators. And initially, we did not have that speed bump. And what we found is that a lot of drivers were hitting those delineators. And so we went out and we purchased these speed bumps and we put them in, and it kind of protects the front of those delineators there. And so that's really saved us a lot in terms of drivers knocking over the posts, and it's also decreased the speeds even more. The one thing to mention here is that we're still keeping an eye on how these weather and how they go through the winter in terms of with snowplows that are hitting them, and how frequently they need to be replaced, and also just paying attention to where we place them in terms of where a bike facility may be, and making sure that they're out of the way and not an unexpected bump in the middle of the road for cyclists. And then just in terms of how we're implementing the left turn traffic calming program, we're trying to do at least 100 locations each year. And we're really focusing on areas that had 5 left turn pedestrian and bike injuries or more, which there are 525 intersections in New York that have that on average. So there's a lot of work to be done, but we're rolling these out pretty quickly. And again, there's a link there for the left turn traffic calming program website if you want to read some more about it. I just want to briefly mention, this is kind of another example of how we're using this, this toolkit of just delineators and some paint. Here we have we designed a mini roundabout, which can be used kind of retrofitted into our more constrained environments. So it's a small roundabout where that center island is traversable for trucks if they need to go across it. But it was a pretty fast installation, process, and it allows us to test out a roundabout, and it worked pretty well. We're also using other things like rubber and plastic, median islands and bus border islands and things like that to really get stuff out there where we have drainage or other constructability issues. And then finally, I want to talk about intersection design for protected bike lanes, because that's been a pretty hot topic for us recently for a number of reasons. One is that we just have a lot of miles of protected bike lanes now, and they've been in long enough that we now have enough data to really conduct an evaluation on these different intersection treatments. So we've been installing protected bike lanes in New York since 2007, and they've really increased the comfort of cycling and attracted a lot of new riders. And they've also increased the safety for cycling along many of these key corridors that we've installed the protected bike lanes on. But the issue, of course, is that protected bike lanes, they're protected mid-block, but not necessarily at the intersections. And so oftentimes the protection drops at the intersections, and unsurprisingly, that's where virtually all of our crashes are occurring. And it's also, the intersections are a really big challenge because there's not a lot of space at intersections. There's a lot of competing movements and demands for different, for all the different modes on the streets. And so they require a lot of attention. And we wanted to really dig into the data a little bit more and just see, how are our treatments doing, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And just to kind of ground you in our terminology really quickly, just from left to right here, the one on the left here is the mixing zone. That's probably our most common intersection treatment. It's basically what we use at a smaller cross street where you can see in the photo the bike lane ends, and a driver who wishes to turn at that intersection will merge into the same space as the cyclist and kind of negotiate that turn. And then the next one is the fully split phase, where we provide the turning vehicles and the cyclist in an entirely separate phase. That's usually used at sort of the wider crossings and the busier crossings. And then as part of the study, we've been piloting a couple other treatments. We've been piloting the delay turn, which is what I discussed with the LPI, but we're adding a bike signal to the mix. So in the photo here, you can see that there's a bike facility against the curb, and then there's actually a turn lane next to it where there's the flashing yellow arrow for drivers. So we were evaluating that as part of the study, as well as what we're calling the offset crossing, which is, I'll talk about that in a few more slides, but it's basically our protected intersection design in a sense. So it's using a lot of the same principles as that, where the idea is to really slow the turns of the vehicles and provide a little bit of a space for drivers to wait for cyclists and pedestrians to cross the intersection before proceeding. And what we did in the study is we looked at it in a few different ways. So safety was the first thing we looked at, but we could only look at crashes for the mixing zone and the fully split phase intersections, and because those are the two where we have some crash history. But we also hung cameras at many of the intersections and looked at conflicts that were occurring and just how people were actually using these designs. So this kind of gets back to Karina's point about like what's intuitive and how people want to use it or how people expect to use it. And then we also had our street ambassadors go out and do cyclist intercept surveys, just as after they had gone through a lot of these different intersection types, just to get a better understanding for how people perceived the safety of these intersection treatments and if they really understood how they're supposed to operate. And what we found is that the fully split phase intersections had the lowest, compared to the mixing zone. They were safer at the wider crossings, but not necessarily at the narrower crossings. So where we had just a shorter crossing, the mixing zone was just as safe as the fully split phase. And what we think is happening there is that when you introduce a fully split phase, you're introducing a lot more delay for cyclists because you're taking away their green time. So the mixing zone, you have the full green time that the cars have in the through movement. But when you split it out between bikes and the turning movement, you're reducing that delay. And then if you have several fully split phase intersections in a row, what we found is that we see a lot of cyclist signal violations. And that's not what we want to design for, but that may be okay from a safety perspective for some of these lower volume crossings. But if people start violating the signals at those, they're going to start violating the signals at these more major crossings, and that's where we saw the crash rate really tick up for the fully split phase. But what we found for the mixing zones is while they were safe, the self-reported comfort level was much lower than the new design of the offset crossing. So we found that the cyclists really preferred the offset crossing and the comfort to that design. And so we were pretty happy with the offset crossing pilot design in general, although we were a little bit concerned about the turning speeds themselves. And we're seeing that cyclists, even though they reported to be more comfortable, they were actually stopping and yielding to drivers much more frequently than we would have expected. And the last thing I'll mention is that really nobody understood who was supposed to yield at any of these intersection treatments. So that's another issue that we need to solve in terms of what makes things intuitive and what the expectations are for the different road users. And all this is summarized in the report, and there's a table in terms of the application considerations where we want to use these different ones based on our safety and comfort findings. So this is a lot to dig into, and I'm running out of time, but there's a link there again that you can go into it, at your leisure. And then I just want to point out a few of the things with the offsite crossing. I mentioned that this is kind of our take on the protected intersection, but the design challenge here is that we have a really constrained geometry to work with. We're not cutting into our curbs at all, into our sidewalk space, and our cross streets in a lot of these cases are 30 feet wide. They're pretty narrow. So this is kind of the evolved design that moves past what we did with our pilot study, where we were concerned about the turning suits are a little bit high. So we've designed this truck apron using a speed bump, which you see there in the black and white speed bump there. The other nice thing about the offset crossing is that it provides an additional pedestrian island on the sort of the upstream side of the crossing, which doesn't exist in a mixing zone. You can see that the conflict point is reduced to a single area, right where that lead cyclist is riding through. And we now have these where we have intersecting protected bike lane facilities. So there's space there to run a curbside protected bike lane on an intersecting street through kind of that turn wedge and provide kind of a protected intersection type of geometry. So we're still studying these. We're still modifying the design. We're still trying to figure out how they work operationally in terms of traffic flow as well. But we're pretty excited about them, and we've been retrofitting a lot of our mixing zones after resurfacing to include this treatment instead, and then a lot of our new projects are getting them. So with that, I think I'm out of time, but excited to talk more during the Q&A or in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carl. That's awesome. I think a lot of folks may have heard of some of the things New York City has been doing, and this is a nice update to that, some familiar things, and then some brand new stuff. So, Carl, I really appreciate your time pulling that together. We're going to move right into Bastian's presentation. So, Bastian, when you're set up, and I see you're getting there right now, we can roll right into it. All right, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you. So in the last presentation today, I want to talk about an assessment method that came out of an NCHRP project, 7-25, that actually is about to wrap up, pedestrian bicycle safety at alternative intersections and interchanges. But you'll see we put alternative into parentheses now because really what we came to find is that the assessment method we come up with really works for many intersections, and seeing the prior presentations by Karina and Carl really resonated, that really some of the concept that we're finding to be challenging from a safety as well as comfort perspective for pedestrians and bicycles at alternative designs really also show up in more conventional intersections. But our initial objective is to develop a guidebook for practitioners improving and integrate pedestrian bicycle safety into the what we now call AIIs, alternative intersections and interchanges. And we expect this guidebook to be published in early 2020. At this point, we have presented an initial draft of our guidebook to our project panel. We're getting ready to submit a revised guidebook very shortly, and then we're hoping to see that through to publication early next year. The key to all this is to move beyond what have now become kind of the standard accommodations, and that's the word that really is almost become a little bit of an undesirable word when it comes to pedestrian bicycle safety, so that the intersections are designed primarily for vehicular traffic, and then we'll need to check the box. Let's get pedestrians and bicycles through there. Let's accommodate them somehow into the design. And really our focus is to really move from accommodation to integration. So as we're laying out the new design, really integrating the best and most viable and most appropriate design early on, which includes decisions of facility selection. And that might be one of those protected bike lanes that Carl mentioned. Really, we need to know that before alternative selection or during alternative selection, so that the adequate right-of-way decisions can be made. Here's the 5 most common alternative designs that hopefully many of you are familiar with. And what is shown here is what has typically been the way that pedestrians and bicycles move through these intersections and interchanges. But we're really taking a fresh look at that and seeing, are there maybe other options? An important thing to remember is really intersection context. And what I mean by that is really to consider where these alternative designs are typically being used. And we saw a lot of examples that Carl showed, for example, of really narrow one-way streets in New York City, where some of the pedestrian bicycle safety treatments are maybe a little more viable when it comes to slower speed facilities and lower vehicular volumes maybe. But we see a lot of the alternative designs really replacing intersections like this. So very, very wide cross sections. There's a skewed approach. We have dual left turns in the east-west direction, and then we have protected permissive left turns in the north-south direction. And we can probably have a separate conversation of which of those is actually worse for pedestrians and bicycles. But so a lot of times these alternative designs are being put in for either a vehicular capacity motivation, so reducing the number of signal phases, redirecting left turns or through movements, replacing complex 8-phase signals with very efficient 2-phase signals to increase the capacity. Or they are put in from a vehicular safety perspective, where through the redirection of movement, through the reduction of conflict points, many of these alternative designs have provided tremendous safety benefits, which certainly ties into Vision Zero initiatives like we heard from New York City. But then there are some challenges for the multimodal users that really we want to get a hold of and get in front of. But I just want to emphasize that we've gotten feedback, well, why don't we build a single lane roundabout? And really these are intersections where the vehicular volumes are just too high for that type of a treatment to be appropriate. So looking at AIs, there are a lot of potential benefits for multimodal users. And so the two images here, those are graphics directly out of our report. These are for a median U-turn intersection or MUT. Where we have potentially reduced pedestrian vehicle conflict points because there are fewer crossings as well as shorter crossings. The simplified signal phasing a lot of times allows us to reduce cycle lengths and therefore reducing wait times for pedestrians. Shorter crossings, a lot of these intersection types use wide medians, so we can implement 2-stage crossings, breaking up those long distances, and then really resulting in crossings that look at one direction of vehicular traffic at a time. So similar to the one-way streets or similar to a roundabout where we have an entry and then the exit, it becomes easier decision-making for pedestrians. And potentially these designs also have reduced turn lanes and may provide opportunities for separated paths as additional right-of-way is being freed up, for example, with a diverging diamond interchange. But there are some real challenges. The designs are unusual, unconventional, and so sometimes the travel paths for both pedestrians and cyclists are altered. Channelized vehicle movement can be challenging for pedestrians, especially if they're unsignalized, because vehicle speeds can be very fast. Channelized movements can also be a challenge for cyclists, especially on-street cyclists. There's a displaced left turn shown on the screen here, where you end up with these cattle chute lanes, so long channelized lanes, several hundred feet long, where cyclists and motor vehicles are sharing space between two curbs, which can be very challenging. Sometimes traffic is coming from unexpected directions, which comes through the redirection of left turns at a DDI or a DLT. The signal phasing may be unusual, and you may end up with crossings that, while shorter and having refuge, they are still multi-stage crossings, which can result in long delay times for pedestrians. To, for example, cross at a DLT here, it may require 2 or 3, maybe even 4 signal cycles, so very long to safely get across the street. But also create some real challenges from an accessibility and wayfinding perspective. And just imagining how a blind, visually impaired traveler would begin to understand how to get across this type of an intersection and understanding where traffic is coming from. When is it coming from the right? When is it coming from the left? Our guidebook really focuses on a performance-based design process, which is very similar to what many of you may be familiar with in the roundabout guide, where we're looking at design checks, fastest path checks, path alignment, design vehicle checks, as well as some multimodal checks. And a lot of this is described in NCHRP report 785. Understand that the next AASHTO Green Book really is going to have much more of an emphasis on performance-based design. And the idea is that it is performance-based as opposed to prescriptive. And that's been really a key for us. It is not the intersection itself that is either good or bad, but it is the nuances within the intersection. It is the turn radius, it is the approach speed of vehicles, it is the sight distances. And so we're really emphasizing these performance checks in the evaluation. A lot of emphasis in our guidebook is really integrating this evaluation in an ICE process, or intersection control evaluation, that many states have adopted at this point, where intersections are being evaluated not only from a traditional vehicular level of service perspective, but also looking at vehicular safety, looking at costs, at life cycle costs, but also evaluating pedestrians and cyclists, multimodal users in the design. What's key for us is that in ICE Stage 1, these are the really early alternatives evaluation, that we need to be able to make decisions on the adequate facility type at that early stage. That if we know early on that because of the level of vehicular volume and the vehicular speed, 40,000 ADT and 50 mile per hour design speed, that we need to select the adequate facility type, especially for bicyclists early on. And this is consistent with the Federal Highway Bicycle Facility Selection Guide that came out earlier this year, which is a great document. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I encourage you to take a look at it online. And then in ICE Stage 2, when we're refining design alternatives and when we're evaluating between maybe a handful of intersections, that's really when we have a more detailed assessment process that I'll spend a little bit of extra time talking about in this presentation. But again, the emphasis in ICE Stage 1 really requiring the facility selection for multimodal users at that early stage. So shifting gears now to our assessment framework, we think of intersection, evaluating this intersections really along three tasks that multimodal users have to perform at an intersection. The first is traversing, which we define as traveling through the intersection along one or more segments, so from start to beginning. And so questions of the separation type, the facility type, potential out of direction travel, realignment with U-turn movements, those are all evaluated in traversing. Wayfinding is slightly different. Wayfinding is the ability to actually navigate whatever the pedestrians or bicycle features are, and actually figuring out where to cross, where to walk, understanding the diverging diamond interchange, the center walkway, that is where they're supposed to be. Understanding for cyclists whether or not they have to go through the U-turn at an R-cut or not. And then finally, the crossing, which is crossing the roadway for pedestrians or crossing the intersections for cyclists, where there are also challenges with potentially permissive vehicular movement and potentially high vehicle speeds. We have condensed all of this assessment in what we call the design flag assessment method. We came up with 20 questions, so there's something to remember. So this is the 20 questions approach to intersection safety, where some of these apply to cyclists, some of these apply to pedestrians, and some of them apply to both. I won't have time in this presentation to go through all 20, but I want to show you just a few examples, and of course you'll have the slides as well, to really understand a little bit better of how we're approaching these. With each of these 20 design flags, we distinguish between what we call a yellow flag and a red flag. The yellow flag is something where the design element impacts user comfort or quality of service. You can think of this as level of stress, which is a familiar concept for evaluating cyclists, or just the quality of the experience. The difference between a yellow flag and a red flag is that a red flag is a design element that is directly related to a safety concern. So just as an example, an unusual walking environment, let's say the center walkway at a DDI, may be unusual and strange for pedestrians at first, but it's actually a quite safe environment. And so as opposed to a movement where pedestrians have to cross 8 or 10 lanes of traffic with permissive turns, or cyclists have to traverse multiple vehicular travel lanes to get to a U-turn pocket. Those are direct safety concerns. And so in the guidebook, we have actual quantitative thresholds to decide which flag is a yellow and which flag is a red. These flags are evaluated for cyclists. They're evaluated for all the turning movements or origin destinations. So all the through, right turns, and left turns at the intersection are evaluated. And for pedestrians, we're evaluating the 4 quadrant-to-quadrant crossings. And so you can envision a design where you pick one quadrant or one approach, you go through each movement and you go through each of the flags, and we'll have some handouts and some checklists basically that help you go through that assessment. And you just go through and you tally up what these various flags are. It may take a little bit of time the first time you're going through it, but then as you become used to it, it does go a little bit quicker. And we have applied this to a few actual case studies at this point, to where we found that you can be quite efficient, similar to the first time you do a road safety audit. Everything is different, new, unusual, but as you become more comfortable with it, things tend to go a little bit more quickly. So I want to share just a few of the design flag examples. So the first one is one that fits right in with the earlier presenters, which is the motorist right turns. And so these can either include right turn on red type situations or right turn on green situations, where pedestrians crossing from either of the blue movements are in conflict with the vehicular right turn. Obviously, treatments such as the ones that Carl mentioned, the leading pedestrian interval, are directly designed to counteract some of these conflicts. What's key is that these conflicts with right turns are not unique to alternative intersections. And so here are 2 conventional intersections, a smaller one and a larger one, one with standard right turns, one with channelized right turns. So the right turn conflicts really show up at all intersections, and they become really a function of a few different dimensions. For example, on the left, you see that the 2 of the right turns have a much wider, larger corner radius than the other 2, which results in much faster design speeds. On the right-hand side, this is an intersection in Boulder, Colorado, where 3 of these channelized right turns have a raised crosswalk, so a speed table that slows down vehicular movement. The 4th one does not. And so the right turns are evaluated as a function of the conflicting vehicular volume as well as the vehicular speed, and there's ways to predict both of those. Another example is indirect path. So I'm skipping over a few flags here. So number 5 is indirect paths, and here's an example of an R-cut or super street, synchronized street. There's different words for this intersection type. The official federal highway term is R-cut, where depending on the origin and destination, there may be some out of direction travel. So pedestrian traveling along the blue line from quadrants B to D has a direct path. A pedestrian traveling from quadrant A to C has a more indirect path, and therefore has some out of direction travel. And that's being evaluated, and depending on how far out of direction that is, we assign a certain rating to it. Here are some examples of conventional intersections. So again, this out of direction travel may show up here as well. On the left is an example intersection, 4 potential crossings, multi-use paths on both sides. One of the crossings is not provided, not unlike the example that Karina had shared from one of the intersections in Pittsburgh. So there's some indirect travel there. On the right, an intersection where, again, there is not necessarily a direct opportunity. The red crossing is not there. The blue is an out of direction travel. And so the evaluation of each of these design flags applies equally to alternative or conventional designs, really with the motivation that we can actually begin to compare those 2 intersection configurations. Here's another example. So I've skipped along here to a flag that is specific to the bicycle movement, and this has proven to be a real challenge at diverging diamond interchanges, a flag we call bicycle clearance time. The concern here is that the green bicycle movement, when going through the intersection towards the end of the vehicular green along the path shown, takes a certain amount of time to get to the conflict point where the red right turning vehicle enters the arterial street. and that clearance time is much longer for bicycles than it is for vehicles. So for vehicles, that might be 4 to 5 seconds. For bicycles, it might be 10 to 15 seconds, which then results in a cyclist arriving just as motorized vehicles are starting to move. This is typically an interchange off-ramp, a freeway off-ramp, so very heavy right turns, and so it can be a real challenge. But here's examples of just a standard intersection. So there's a bike lane going here from the kind of the bottom right to the top left. The clearance time to get across these 8 or more lanes across the corresponding all red time for vehicles may be on the order of 1 to 2 seconds. Cyclists need at least 5 or 6 seconds, maybe more, depending on your level of expertise and grades and all these considerations. So there might be some clearance time concerns there, where a cyclist is caught in the middle of an intersection when the conflicting vehicular phase gets a green indication. And then finally, the concern here of a lane change across motor vehicle lanes. So here's an example, the intended left turn maneuver here for cyclists, which is the green line, and the left turn for, or the movement for the vehicles in red. That cyclists wanting to complete that maneuver without the 2-stage left turn box, which is actually something we've added to this intersection configuration. But the expectation for cyclists to do 2 lane changes or more across heavy vehicular volume that may be traveling at 40, 50 miles an hour is a real safety concern. And so expecting not only the outer direction travel that is evident here, so there's 2 flags in play for this particular example, but then the safety concern of the lane change maneuver, it is really a concern or it can be a concern at either the median U-turns or the R-cuts. But again, here's an example of a neighborhood street where that is also the case. So we see kind of at the bottom here an on-street bike lane and then a downstream left turn pocket. So in order for cyclists to complete that left turning maneuver, they also have to lane change across motor vehicle traffic. Now, you might argue that in this particular case, that is a more comfortable and safer maneuver than in the prior example, and that's exactly the case. So in evaluating whether this type of a situation is a yellow flag or a red flag, we're really looking at the conflicting vehicle speed, the conflicting vehicle volume, the number of lanes to decide, is this something that is reasonable to expect from cyclists, or is this something that really is an unsafe situation? So overall, we have 20 of these flags. I only showed you an example of 4, but once the guidebook comes out, you can see all of these. And again, they apply equally to either the alternative designs or the conventional designs. And it will allow you to do a comparison. Here's an example of, let's say, 4 alternatives, A through D, where you go through the overall assessment for pedestrians, the overall assessment for bicycles, and you can tally up the percentage of movements that are classified with either a red flag or a yellow flag. And in this particular case, alternative C is the one that stands out as being the safest for pedestrians and bicycles. But the guidebook doesn't stop there. And in the interest of time, I can't go into a lot of detail, but really the next step after doing this assessment is to then go to treatments. And so we have, the assessment is actually chapter 4 of a total of 9 chapters. And really the remainder of the chapters are then geared at evaluating treatments and countermeasures to then overcome some of these design flags, which can either be spot treatments, such as the raised crosswalk in a channelized lane, or it could be treatments that just entirely reevaluate and re-envision what these intersections look like. So for example, with the R-cut configuration, so all of these are maybe different from the standard, where we do have bike lanes, but we also have multi-use paths. We have off-ramps for bicycles to use the sidewalk network, similar to a roundabout. We have U-turn crossing opportunities to provide more ability for pedestrians to get across the street. R-cuts where the direct left turns for the vehicles are taken out to allow a more direct crossing for pedestrians and cyclists across the street, or even with the U-turn, introducing a third signal phase, still very efficient and still very safe, but providing a more direct experience for cyclists and pedestrians to get across the street. So these are just some examples of really re-envisioning what these alternative designs can look like based on the assessment process. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bastian. I appreciate that. What I'm gonna do here is shift the screen back over to me, because we're gonna have a short bit of time here for some Q&A, and I want to get in as many questions as possible. What great presentations! I think they lead us in well to a discussion period. I'm gonna actually squeeze in just one more poll question here. We talked about a lot of countermeasures and different designs today. I picked a few of them, and I want to ask you all which of these you have experience with in your own communities, actually putting on the ground. So we've got LPIs, leading pedestrian intervals, alternative intersection designs, hardened center lines, roundabouts. And we've got an option, if your community hasn't done any of these, you can pick that too. You can actually pick multiple choices. So spend some time voting on this poll, but I do want to kick things off with a question while it's open, if that's okay with everybody. And I wanted to first start with both Carl and with Bastian. We had several folks, more than a few, asking during Carl's presentation about what about accessible pedestrian signals alongside the leading pedestrian interval. For individuals with low vision or who are blind, how do they safely and properly navigate an intersection using an LPI? That's one part of it. And then Bastian, your presentation, there were some additional questions about these are seemingly fairly complex, and I wonder if you've looked at, for locations with roundabouts and with alternative intersections, are there specific recommendations for those with low vision, accessible pedestrian signals, other things we can be doing to help their ability to navigate these intersections safely? So maybe Carl, we can start, and then Bastian to follow up on that, if that's okay. Carl, you may be still on mute. And Bastian, while Carl's trying to pull his line open, maybe you could kick things off for that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think on the leading pedestrian interval, my experience, and I haven't seen the ones in New York City, but the ones that I've seen in other cities, they're typically for the pedestrian, the experience wouldn't necessarily be different, right? So you would still have a push button integrated APS device, kind of consistent with the access board recommendations. And so you just have pedestrians being able to cross, only that there isn't that vehicle conflict, because right turn on reds wouldn't be allowed typically, and then the vehicles are held back a little bit further. So for the pedestrian, the experience should be about the same. There is a little bit of a caveat there where a lot of blind travelers have traditionally learned and been taught to cross with the surge of parallel vehicular traffic, which is really the only technique to cross the street prior to an installation of an audible device. And so somebody who's used to that technique, who doesn't have that surge because of the LPI, there might be some confusion there. I'm not sure if any research has been done on that, but with a proper installation of APS, I would think that the LPIs would be sufficiently accessible.
Oh, great, thank you. And Carl, looks like your line's open. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, just briefly, yeah. So Sebastian hit on the main concern where blind pedestrians queue off of the adjacent traffic, which when we have a 7-second LPI, they're not able to enter the roadway during that 7-second LPI, which could lead to some confusion perhaps from drivers who are unsure if they are planning on crossing or if they're just waiting on the corner. So that's one of the reasons why we have a sort of a prioritization process for installing APS throughout the city, and LPIs is one of the key considerations for that.
Great, thank you so much. And the poll question now is completed, and I'm showing the results. I wanted to just echo or let everybody know, if you can't see the results, 77% of you have experience installing roundabouts. Almost half of you, 47%, with LPIs. 39% are using alternative intersection designs, and 12% hardened center lines. That's maybe more than I would have expected, 12%. So, and then some of you haven't used any of these, but probably other treatments you have used. So I think that's interesting to see sort of that range there. My next question is one related to political will. Political will is something that was brought up as sort of an impediment a lot of folks are facing to make these needed changes to their intersections. And I wanted to ask Karina if you'd be able to respond to this question about how important is it to not only for the staff in the department to know about countermeasures and how to design, but to also have that sort of policy level, I don't know if I want to say directive, but that statement that says, we are putting our emphasis on this particular problem, to have that from the top down to really indicate support for these changes. From your experience, and maybe in Pittsburgh, is that sort of the way you're approaching this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the folks that are on the call know that that is, it is essential. And I do think that, part of our jobs now as transportation professionals are to be good storytellers, to be able to explain not just, and that's part of the reason why our goals are so layperson goals. We want to reduce VMTs, and we want to, improve the NOx emissions, and we want to do all kinds of other things that regular people don't talk about. So being able to explain it in ways that the average person on the street can understand in a very short period of time is absolutely essential to gaining that political support and to gaining the sort of will to follow through and understanding what the trade-offs are, because we always say all the easy stuff has been done. So everything that we have from here on out are hard trade-offs, and we need to be able to explain what needs to be weighed in that.
Yeah, no, very good. Thank you so much for that. We had a lot of questions about not just we've talked a lot about pedestrians and bicyclists and motorists, but we obviously, a lot of our cities have emerging vehicles that are using our streets, scooters and other e-bikes and other things that are sharing our space. And Bastian, I don't think this was an explicit focus of the NCHRP project, but I was looking at some of your slides wondering, are you seeing opportunities for designs to change, or are designs being adjusted from your perspective as we consider these different user categories that are emerging on our streets? From your perspective, is that starting to pick up?
Yeah, I believe that they are, although I would say that some of the biggest challenges is still the kind of the way the traditional design process has been, where, and I alluded to that, where the facilities are not being selected early enough. So that designs, they end up going through right of way, and they end up being at the 30% plan stage or later, and then somebody raises some issues for pedestrians and cyclists, and then frankly it's too late. But we are seeing changes. I'll use the diverging diamond interchange as an example, where the first DDIs that opened to traffic had very much a vehicular focus, accommodating large trucks, these wide swooping turns at the interchanges, which then created some real challenges for pedestrians to get across those channelized lanes, especially the on-ramps. So expecting pedestrians to cross the street without a signal as vehicles are accelerating to freeway speed, it's frankly not feasible. But agencies have responded, and they've responded through design by making the turns tighter, so forcing the vehicles to go slower and then accelerate after the crosswalk. Shifting the crosswalk somewhere where there's better visibility and line of sight, and then signalizing the crosswalk. So integrating the channelized turn lanes into the overall signal timing, to where pedestrians have a push button and get a protected crossing with a walk interval. So these are just some examples where we have seen changes, and I think that also for the other designs, there's been a lot of we've seen it in public meetings where there's just been a much more outspoken constituency talking about the pedestrian bicycle aspects of these designs, and agencies really responding with looking for solutions and then applying them.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. Thanks, Bastian. I wanted to actually see if Carl and Karina had a response to that one as well. If that's a emerging growth issue that you're tackling right now with other vehicle types that you're trying to build into your system.
Well, I'll jump in and say that we just had this discussion yesterday. In fact, here in Pittsburgh, as we are kind of halfway through or coming toward the finish line of our next 10-year bike plan. And we've made the very deliberate decision that we will not have a bike plan, that we will make this a micromobility plan, and that does mean that we do now need to challenge those that are helping us with this plan to think about what other design specifications, design modifications we then need to think about when we do have vehicles of different types, and when you're now talking about a not inconsequential speed differential happening in what was previously just a bicycle lane. And now, because we've made the decision here in Pittsburgh, we do not want these devices on our sidewalks. We do want them in more protected facilities, and those protected facilities will be shared. So now we need to think about what are the dimensions of these to allow passing, what is the intersections like, how do we handle that? So it's a very timely discussion.
Great, thank you. And Carl, I actually wondered, there's another question I wanted to sneak in because we're just at the end of our time here, but there was so much interest in the bit of information you shared about some of the roundabout projects that you all are working on and some of those materials, and a lot of interest in where people can maybe find a little bit more about that. And do you guys have any of your own design guidelines and specifications for some of that work that we could point people to?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. So we don't really, that's our first one. I think we have only 2 roundabouts in the city, so we don't have a lot of guidance. I'm not sure, but there's probably a project presentation, I'm sure, on our website, but I could send it to you, Dan, if you want to send it out later.
And maybe add the archive page if we can add some information there. That'd be a good way to do it.
Yeah.
Follow those with interest for sure. We are a bit past our end time, and I apologize for that. I do regret that we didn't get to many of the questions that you all have. I tried to roll through quite a few of them. The contact information on the screen is hopefully another way for you to get in touch with us and find out where you can find the information you're looking for. There's a lot in this webinar, and I really appreciate everybody's time participating in it and sharing this information from our panelists. I want to remind everyone that an email is going to be coming in about an hour that will share a link to the archive page where you can find the video recording and the slides. We will be sending you a link that you can use to generate a certificate of attendance. We've got a survey coming up after the webinar that'll ask you a few questions about issues we talked about today, what you thought about the webinar, what we could be covering in future webinars. So we'd appreciate your time filling that out. I just want to extend a special big thanks again to Jeff Shaw and the focus approach areas for contributing to this webinar, for Karina Ricks, Carl Sundstrom, and Bastian Schroeder for participating and presenting on their projects. We really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for sitting in on this webinar with us today. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much, everybody.